So this is our individuation in light of notions of form and information. We're picking up from page 348 of the translation, and so that is in the fourth part on collective individuation, the second chapter of that part, and then the second section of that chapter. So last time we started on the second chapter, we saw this distinction between the individual and the subject that he makes. So the subject is the individual plus this part of the pre-individual that is associated with it. So we have these three phases of being. So there's the pre-individual being, this undifferentiated phase of being that undergoes a differentiation or a split of some kind into an individual and then an associated milieu that remains unindividuated. And then the third phase, what he calls the transindividual, which we've seen in a number of different aspects throughout this part of the book. So the subject is the individual together with the associated milieu that is not individuated. So the subject is something greater than the individual. Sort of a parenthetical remark about language, which is something that doesn't come up very much for Simondon, but he says that we can't treat language as the basis for signification. We have to go in the other direction. We have to take some sort of pre-existing signification as the basis for language. So it's only because the subject is a subject that has the capacity to undergo individuation that they can have something like an understanding of significations. And that understanding of significations is the prerequisite or the basis for language. And so he's distancing himself here from, or maybe not explicitly, but there's a pretty widespread consensus or school of thought, I guess, that takes language as something fundamental to the capacity for understanding in human beings. And so Simondon is differentiating himself from that tradition. And then we saw his discussion of sexuality, and sexuality for Simondon is something that is sort of intermediate or that mediates between the pre-individual and the individual. So it's something within the individual, but it's not purely of the individual. So it surpasses the individual. And he criticizes Freud, or sets himself in opposition to Freud, in that he thinks Freud treats sexuality as a property of the individual, as opposed to something outside of the individual. Yes, and so he uses this term metaxu, the Greek term, meaning something beyond, something that goes beyond the individual. And then, so he argues that sexuality is something that goes beyond the individual, and if we want to talk about the pathogenic factors in a person, we have to look not just at the individual and not just at what is in the individual, but rather we have to look to the subject. So this relationship between the pre-individual and the individuated being that is the individual is something that can bring about pathologies like neuroses, for example. And so this notion of the subject as containing both the pre-individual reality and the individuated being is sort of brought to bear on the relationship between the individual and the collective. And so and we've seen in the last chapter his account of the collective as a not just a grouping of already individuated beings, but as a new individuation. And so it's only because the subject has this unindividuated aspect to it. It has some portion of pre-individual reality still contained within it. It's only because of that it can actually undergo a second individuation in the form of a collective. He makes reference to Sondi, who was a psychologist who came up with this concept of analysis of destiny, And so Simondon takes this to be a way of accounting for this pre-individual or this aspect of nature, what he calls nature in the human being. I really don't know anything about Sondi, but that would be something to investigate, like what exactly Simondon was drawing on in his work. But yeah, so that's the sort of the main piece of what we looked at last time. And then we're going to continue to see more about the relationship between the subject and the individual, and then the subject and the collective in the remainder of this chapter. Okay, so I'll start with this short subsection 2. Okay, so the subject and the individual. One of the things that seems to emerge from this partial and hypothetical study is that the name individual is improperly given to a more complex reality, that of the complete subject, which, in addition to individuated reality, includes within it an unindividuated, pre-individual, or even natural aspect. This unindividuated charge of reality conceals a power of individuation which, within the subject alone, cannot conclude, whether due to the being's poverty, isolation, or the lack of a systematic whole. Gathered with other subjects, the subject can correlatively be the theater and agent of a second individuation that gives birth to the transindividual collective and links the subject to other subjects. The collective is not nature, but it supposes the preliminary existence of a nature attached to subjects between which collectivity is established by their overlapping. Beings are linked to one another in the collective not actually as individuals, but as subjects, i.e., as beings that contain the pre-individual. This doctrine would aim to consider individuation as a phase of being. This phase, moreover, cannot exhaust the possibilities of pre-individual being, such that a first individuation gives birth to beings that still comes with them. Although they are too weak in each being, these potentials joined together can carry out a second individuation, the collective, thus linking individuated beings via the pre-individual that they can serve and can include. The particular being is thus more than an individual. It is first an individual on its own as the result of a first individuation. A second time, it is a member of the collective, which is what makes it participate in a second individuation. The collective is not a milieu for the individual, but a set of participations in which it enters through this second individuation that choice is when it is expressed as a transindividual reality. The subject being can be conceived as a more or less perfectly coherent system of three successive phases of being: the pre-individual phase, the individuated phase, and the transindividual phase, all of which partially but not completely correspond to what is designated by the concepts of nature, individual, and spirituality. The subject is not a phase of being opposed to that of the object, but the condensed and systematized unity of the three phases of. Right. So this subsection is pretty clear, I think. In general, it doesn't require a lot of analysis, but maybe just to point back to a couple of points that he's brought up before. So again, he's using the word nature as a synonym for the charge of the pre-individual that remains with the individual in constituting the subject, and so he's drawing from the pre-Socratic philosophers to use this term nature in this way, so he talks about these three phases of being. So the pre-individual phase, and then the splitting into the individuated being and its associated milieu as the second phase. And then the third phase is this transindividual. So this, what we've seen throughout this last chapter, we've seen the way that the transindividual is something within the individual, within the subject that is beyond the individuated being that it is. And so anything like a collective requires this ability for the subject to undergo a further individuation after the one that produces it as an individuated being. And so it's the association of the potentials that are contained within multiple individuals that allows for a further individuation to. And Angus has posted a comment here in the chat about how nature is associated with the pre-individual, but in other places he associates the pre-individual with the future. So there's a sort of temporality of the a priori and a posteriori for Simondon. Yes, that's definitely the case. So he we saw this even back in the introduction of the book, where he talks about the a priori and a posteriori, and then he introduces this term a presenti as the temporality of genesis or of transductive thinking, so in later parts of the book, we've seen how the pre-individual is associated with the future as in the sense of being a set of potentials for future transformations. So there's always this charge of potentiality that remains with with individuated beings or alongside individuated beings, that allows them to undergo further transformations in the future. Right, and then a question from Varun. Is the pre-individual meant to be understood as an excess? I think I'm not sure if Simondon would use the term excess, because for Simondon, the pre-individual precedes the individuated being in terms of a sort of logical order of priority, or in terms of the order of genesis. So the pre-individual is what is more fundamental or more primary, and then the individuated being is the result of a process of genesis, a process of individuation that occurs within the pre-individual being. So it's not like, I think the term excess suggests something like something that it would be maybe the other order of priority. It would be individuals, and then there would be some sort of excess within those individuals. So I think the order of priority that Simondon uses would suggest that excess is probably not a term that he would want to use.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification. So the way I understand it is that the pre-individual is like a field of potentials, and the individual is a sort of... Would it be correct to say that the individual is a resolution to the potentials of the pre-individual?
Yeah, I think that's right. So there's this notion of disparation that Simondon uses. So we've seen this a few times throughout the book, but he's drawing it from the psychology of visual perception. So in the same way that the two retinal images in your eyes are different, but then they combine to form a single image of the world, or a single perception of the world. In the same way, the pre-individual, as this set of potentials, includes this tension or this disparation between different elements of reality, and the process of individuation is a process of solving those problems, or of resolving, of including both aspects of this disparation, or these incompatible aspects of reality, and making them compatible by inventing or discovering a new dimension.
Yeah, thanks for that. That helps.
Right. Yeah. So so individuation is always a resolution of a problem. And this is the case, especially like when we talk about the psychical individuation, we can sort of understand that in a literal sense, like the subject is presented with a problem of making compatible two different drives, or two different goals, or making compatible two different perceptions, or any other psychical contents that we want to talk about. But this is also the case even when we're talking about physical individuation. So the formation of a crystal is a solution to a problem of the potentials that are present in the liquid form of the substance.
But one last tangential question. So the individual is it would be incorrect to understand the individual as an accident, right?
I would say that there's a certain aspect that is accidental in the sense that for Simondon, there's always something external that sort of elicits the process of individuation. So in the part on physical individuation, he talks about the material condition of individuation, just the substance that is going to undergo individuation, and then the informational condition. So in the case of crystallization, there has to be a germ of a crystal, some sort of external factor that is inserted into the liquid form, and then the liquid undergoes crystallization around that crystalline germ. So there's this sort of external factor that intervenes, this crystalline germ that has to be introduced into the liquid. This is a sort of external or accidental factor. But then the structure of the crystal that forms is not accidental. So each substance has a certain crystalline structure or a certain set of crystalline structures that it's capable of producing. So there's a certain accidental aspect to the individual in terms of that informational condition, but then the material condition brings about a non-accidental aspect of the individual by undergoing structuration.
Yeah, that helps. Thanks.
Right. So I think we can go on to the next subsection. Let's see how long. Yeah, this is another short one. So if someone else would like to read the whole subsection, about a page or so.
Yeah, I can read. Subsection 3, the empirical and the transcendental, ontogenesis and precritical ontology, the collective as signification that overcomes a disparation. This manner of envisioning the subject allows us to avoid the difficult distinction of the transcendental and the empirical. It also saves anthropology from the dead end of an absolute point of departure for the knowledge of man based on an essence. The individual is not everything in man, for the individual is the result of a preliminary individuation. A pre-individual knowledge of the being is necessary. The being as individuated must not be considered as absolutely given. Ontogenesis must be integrated into the domain of philosophical examination, instead of considering the individuated being as absolutely first. This integration would allow for the surpassing of certain ontological postulates of critique, postulates which are essentially relative to individuation. It would also allow us to refuse a classification of beings into genera that do not correspond to their genesis, but instead correspond to a knowledge of beings considered after genesis, concerning which we have asserted that it was the foundation of every scholasticism. It is therefore a question of witnessing the genesis of individuated beings based on pre-individual reality, which contains potentials that are resolved and determined within systems of individuation. To try to lead to this institution of a precritical ontology that is an ontogenesis, we have wanted to create the notion of phases of being. This notion to us has seemed to be established on the basis of the notion of information, which is destined to replace the notion of form, such as it is implicated in the insufficient hylomorphic schema. Information is not a system of form and matter, but a system of form and form, which supposes inequality and homogeneity of both terms, along with a certain discrepancy that founds signification and collective reality, such as visual disparation. The collective is the signification obtained by the superposition of beings that are disparate by themselves in a single system. It is an encounter of dynamic forms established into a system, a realized, consummated significative, that requires passage to a superior level, i.e., the advent of the collective as a unified system of reciprocal beings. The collective personality of the individual is what can become significant relative to other collective personalities evoked at the same moment by a play of reciprocal causality. Reciprocity, internal resonance, is the condition for the advent of the collective. The collective is what results from a secondary individuation relative to vital individuation, since it takes back up what the first individuation had left unused of bare nature in the living being. The second individuation does not fully overlap the first. Despite the collective, the individual dies as an individual, and participation in the collective cannot save it from this death, which is a consequence of the first individuation. The second individuation, that of the collective and the spiritual, gives birth to transindividual significations that do not die with the individuals by which they are constituted. What there is of pre-individual nature in the subject can survive the individual that has a living being as signification. Non omnis moriar, not everything dies, is true in a certain sense. But it would be necessary to be able to alter this judgment with an index that deprives it of personality in the first person. This is no longer the individual, and it is barely the subject that lives beyond itself. The charge of nature associated with the subject, which has become a signification integrated into the collective, is what survives here and now of the individual contained in the subject being. The only chance for the individual, or rather for the subject, to live beyond itself in some fashion is to become signification, to make it such that something of itself becomes signification. This is still a fairly unsatisfying perspective for the subject, since the task of the discovery of significations and of the collective is submitted to chance. Nevertheless, the subject being can hardly live beyond itself, and the generalized collective accepts as information. Participating in collective individuation, the subject infuses something of itself, which is not individuality, into a reality that is more stable than it. There is contact with the being via associated nature. This contact is information. So this idea of the part of the subject living on after the death of the individual sort of recalls that earlier that section, I guess we read a couple months ago, about the persistence of the psychological individual after death through the reversal or the inversion of the sign of the individual in these kind of rituals of remembrance or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So this notion of an immortality through the collective is something that we've seen throughout the last two parts of the book on psychical individuation and collective individuation, sort of interspersed throughout those two parts of the book. So for Simondon, there's no sort of personal immortality in the sense of the individual surviving as a sort of disembodied soul or whatever other depiction you would want to use of personal immortality or personal survival after death. But what there is this sort of impersonal survival or this impersonal immortality. And he talks about this in relation to spirituality in a part that we read a few months ago, maybe a month ago. So he talks about the spirituality of the works of the poet, like Horace talks about the works that are more lasting than bronze. So there's this notion of the spirituality as what survives in the collective and gives the individual, or gives the subject rather, the capacity for this impersonal immortality. But then there's also this other aspect of spirituality, this fleeting spirituality. So he talks about the gesture of the slave trying to escape its master. So the slave has this gesture that sort of disappears as soon as it happens, and this is a kind of spirituality in the same or in this alternate relation with temporality. So it's this disappearing spirituality, and so I think we can also treat this second form of the spiritual, this sort of fleeting spirituality, as yes, I think exactly that is right, Angus. So there's some sort of eternal, there's something eternal about this moment, even if it sort of disappears without leaving a trace. If the slave ends up being caught and executed, and there's no sort of lasting result of this moment, there's still this sort of eternal aspect in the way that this gesture of the slave can be repeated in the collective. So you can look at the Spartacus rebellion in ancient Rome, and the way that this has served as a sort of inspiration for slave revolts, like the Haitian Revolution in the 19th century, sort of looked back at this as a model, and you can have a repetition or a reincarnation in a way of these types of fleeting gestures that allows for them to have this immortality to them. So even something that at the time and for centuries afterwards has no lasting significance, that seems to have disappeared, can be sort of revitalized or recreated by a future generation. And so it's that in that sense that there's this impersonal immortality of the spiritual, even when it's something that has no immediate effect.
I don't want to digress too much, but I think that this is interesting to think of in light of the idea that the transindividual is sort of the present, because it seems like, there's a kind of shared present of this, the desperate gesture and revolt, but even if I guess the present is not really at the same time, I think this kind of links to, we talked a little bit about like Emily Dickinson, as like being a part of a collective, even though she was sort of like an extreme recluse, insofar as she wrote this poetry that was taken up later on. So I don't know, the idea of the present that isn't necessarily like contemporaneous is interesting.
Yeah, and we saw a few weeks ago this notion of this ordeal of solitude that is involved in at least one aspect of the transindividual. We've sort of come to the conclusion that there are sort of two sides to the transindividual, and one of them requires this ordeal of solitude. So it's not just getting together with a group of friends, or even going to some sort of event with hundreds of other people that brings about a collective in the proper sense of the term. There has to be this this ordeal of solitude, so that the subject has to go through this sort of disadaptation in order to re-individuate in the form of the collective. And so someone who, as a poet or an artist or whatever other work of spirituality in the broadest sense, they might be completely isolated in their own time. They might be working without having any recognition, or without anyone else sort of being part of a collective with them. But then future generations can take up that work that was done in isolation, and make it part of the collective signification and have a collective individuation around that work that makes it have this impersonal immortality.
I am curious to return back to the opening of that section. So the way he sort of solves the problem of the Kantian distinction between the transcendental and the empirical, right? The relationship between thought and being, by using ontogenesis. I mean, I think this is really interesting in relation to the way Simondon talks about the epistemological problem of individuation, right? Because what he says about is that we can, to know individuation is to already individuate. So the way, we come to the knowledge of individuation is essentially through this analogical operation. That is to say, the individuation of our knowledge must correlate with the individuation of our object. And in forming that distinction, the knowledge he sort of gets past that relationship between thought and being by saying that the knowledge of individuation is an analogical operation of the same way we individuate knowledge. It matches with the way we individuate the object, or the way the object individuates.
Yeah. So there's a bit in the introduction where he talks about that relationship between transductive knowledge, so knowing a process of individuation, and then transductive thinking as a thinking that undergoes individuation, and so you can't have knowledge of individuation through concepts as something fixed. So you can't say that you can't have knowledge of individuation by classifying individuals. He sort of constantly brings up this impossibility of classificatory thought as a way of knowing individuals in their individuation, and this comes up also in the work on the mode of existence of technical objects. He makes the same remark about classification in that work as well. And so you can't have a knowledge of individuation by classifying an individual under a certain concept, and then a hierarchy of concepts of species and genus and so on. You can only have knowledge of the individual by undergoing individuation yourself as a knowing subject. And so here, in relation to this distinction between the empirical and the transcendental subject, so this, of course, is one of the more obscure points of Kant's system. So, I mean, we have an idea, at least a pre-theoretical idea of what it means to be an empirical subject, where we experience ourselves as spatio-temporally located beings. We're in a certain place and time, and we have relationships with other objects around us and so on. But then in some obscure sense, or some not quite obvious sense, we also have to understand ourselves as being responsible for the spatio-temporal structure of our experience. For Kant, I mean, and so the forms of space and time are imposed by the subject in some way, and what relationship there is between this transcendental subject and the empirical subject is a difficult question, and even in and Kant even says even in internal experience we only ever experience ourselves as empirical subjects. So when we think of ourselves, we are always thinking of ourselves as a certain person, as opposed to other people, and having certain personal characteristics or preferences and personality and so on. All this is already sort of built in, and we can never experience ourselves as transcendental subjects, even in inner experience. So he appeals to this notion of a synthetic unity of apperception. somehow the unity of experience is itself the unity of experience is the constitution of a transcendental subject. So the unity of the subject and the unity of experience are sort of co-constitutive or appear at the same time. But for Simondon, he argues that this notion of a transcendental subject or this distinction between empirical subject and transcendental subject is already presupposing that there is something like an individual. The subject is something like an individual, and then the question is like how is that individual related to other beings and in experience, and how does it how do the various forms of that subject get sort of imposed on the matter of sensation and so on. Whereas for Simondon, what we want to do is instead of presupposing that there's something like a subject as an individual, we want to observe the genesis of the individual. So the individual is always something secondary, something that appears, or something that has a genesis for Simondon. And then we aren't sort of faced with this problem of relating the subjects to other entities, because the subject is always a product of a process of individuation that goes beyond the subject. So there's always this associated milieu that comes together with it. So this is sort of how Simondon wants to get around this whole problem of the relationship between the empirical and transcendental subjects for Kant.
Yeah, it's an interesting critique, because what he's saying is the distinction between the transcendental and the empirical comes up only if we don't give an accurate account of we don't give a genealogical or genetic account of the subject.
Yeah, exactly. So if we presuppose the subject as an already individuated being, and we start from that point, then we're sort of stuck. We can't really give an intelligible account of what the relationship is between the empirical and transcendental subject, and there's a sort of mysterious. The whole notion of a transcendental subject remains sort of mysterious. Whereas what Simondon wants to do is to actually sort of show us the genesis of the subject, and then we don't have this mysterious transcendental subject to deal with. Okay, so let's go on to the next section, which is a bit longer. So let's read about a page or so and then stop for discussion if someone else would like to read.
I don't mind giving it a go. We're at the gist, right? Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
The gist of this study is the following. The hylomorphic schema must be abandoned. To think individuation, veritable individuation, does not amount to a form-taking. The operation of individuation is much more general and much vaster phenomenon than simply form-taking. Form-taking can be thought based on individuation, but individuation cannot be thought based on the paradigm of form-thinking. The hylomorphic schema includes and accepts a dark zone, which is precisely the central operational zone. It is the example and the model of all logical processes, though which a fundamental role is attributed to borderline cases, to the extreme terms of a reality organized into series, as if the series could be generated based on its boundaries. According to the method presupposed to replace the hylomorphic schema, the being must be grasped in its entirety, and the milieu of an ordered real is as substantial as it is extreme terms. The dark zone conveyed by the hylomorphic schema projects its shadow over every reality known by way of the schema. The hylomorphic schema improperly replaces the knowledge of the genesis of a real. It prevents the knowledge of ontogenesis. Should I read the next paragraph too?
Yeah, you can keep going. You can read the next couple paragraphs.
In psychology, the median zone of the being is thrust back into the irrational and the unknowable that cannot be experienced or known. The psychosomatic relation poses unsolvable problems. However, perhaps it should be asked whether the notion of the psychophysiological relation is illusory, and merely expresses the fact that one has wanted to consider, the being as the result of a form taking and to grasp it by way of the hylomorphic schema after it has been constituted. The impossibility of reaching a clear relation of the soul and the body merely expresses the being's resistance to the imposition of the hylomorphic schema. The substantialized terms of soul and body can be nothing but artifacts that stem from this effort to know the being by way of the schema, which first requires a preliminary reduction of the entire spectrum of reality that constitutes the being in its extreme terms, considered as matter and form. The study of groups also reveals the same existence of a dark zone. The body of groups is known by way of social morphology. Group representations are the object of interpsychology and microsociology, but between the two extremes extends the dark relational zone, that of the real collective. The ontogenesis which seems to be thrust back into the unknowable. According to the attitude of sociological objectivity, to grasp the reality of groups as a fact is to come after the individuation that founds the collective. To start with interpsychological postulates is to place oneself before the group individuation and to want to extract this group of physical dynamisms that are internal to individuals or to individuals' tendencies or social needs. However, the veritable collective that is contemporaneous with the operation of individuation cannot be known as a relation between the extreme terms of the pure social and pure physical. The collective is the very being that spans the spectrum from social exteriority to physical interiority. The social and the physical are nothing but borderline cases. They are not the foundations of reality, the true terms of relation. There is nothing but extreme terms for the gaze of knowledge, insofar as knowledge must be applied to a hylomorphic schema, a pair of clear notions that cling to an obscure relation. The representation of individuation that grasps the being in its center of activity stands against the hylomorphic schema. But in order for the notion of individuation to be fully dissociated from the hylomorphic schema, a procedure of thought must be elaborated that does not invoke a classification and forgoes the definition of essence via the inclusion or exclusion of characteristics. This is because classification, which permits a knowledge of beings via common genus and specific differences, supposes the usage of the hylomorphic schema. Form gives to the genus its signification relative to the species, which are its matter. The thought that can be called transductive does not consider that the unity of a being is conferred by the form informing a matter, but by a definite regime of operation of individuation that founds the being absolutely. The being's cohesion forms the being's unity, not the rapport of a form to a matter. The being's unity is a regime of activity that transverses the being, going from part to part, converting structure into function and function into structure. The being is relation for relation, is the eternal resonance of the being's relative to itself, the manner in which it is conditioned reciprocally within itself, splitting and reconverting to unity. The being's unity can only be understood based on individuation, absolute ontogenesis. The being is one because it is a symbol of itself, harmonizing with and reverberating within itself. Relation can never be conceived as a relation between pre-existing terms, since it is a reciprocal regime of information exchange and of causality in a system that individuates. Relation exists physically, biologically, psychologically, collectively as the eternal resonance of the individuated being. Relation expresses individuation as at the being's center.
Yeah, we can stop here.
There we go.
Oh yeah, great. Yeah, so yeah, you're able to unmute now. Yeah, so this bit, this last section of the chapter is basically a summary of what we've seen in this whole part of the book. He's sort of summarizing before we get to the conclusion, but he's calling back to this criticism of the hylomorphic schema that we saw in the first part of the book. This hylomorphic schema, so hylomorphism means the relationship between form and matter, or a representation in which entities consist of a form and a matter. And for Simondon, the major criticism that he makes is that the actual relationship between the form and the matter is left obscure in the hylomorphic schema. So you have a clear notion of form and you have a clear notion of matter. But then when you actually look at how the form comes to be imposed on the matter, the actual relationship is left obscure. And the example that he starts from in this book is the example of forming a brick. And so you have this geometrical form of the brick, and you want to impose it on a bunch of clay. But then the actual operation of imposing that form on the clay is left obscure. And so instead of starting from the two extreme terms of form and matter, we instead want to start from the middle of the process. So we want to start from the individuation process itself. We start from the individuation itself, and we can see form and matter as sort of extreme cases that or abstractions from the what is actually real, which is the process of individuation. So in the case of soul and body is one example that he brings up here. So the relationship between soul and body is presented as one of matter and form, or form and matter, I should say. So the soul as the form of the body. This is a sort of classical Aristotelian notion of what the soul consists in, and so for Simondon, this is an inadequate depiction of psychosomatic unity, because it again leaves obscure what the relationship is and the relationship between these two terms. And then we see, particularly with Descartes, when we get to this idea of the relationship between the soul and the body, we have this strange doctrine of the pineal gland as being, in some sense, the locus of the relationship between soul and body, and working through the subtle matter that fills our nerves, and changing the direction of the subtle matter through some mysterious process. And any doctrine of dualism of soul and body seems to be faced with the same type of problem. If we conceive of soul and body as these two distinct substances that are supposed to interact in some way, it seems like that interaction is always going to be left obscure. And so we can instead start from the genesis of the psychical individual, and then something purely somatic or something purely psychical would be sort of extreme points in the series that makes up that genesis, rather than the starting points that then have to interact with each other in some way. And this also applies to the relationship between the individual and the group. So if you start from the notion of the group as this sort of objective whole that the individual is subordinated to, you're sort of presupposing the existence of the whole, and then the whole is a sort of individual, like a giant individual in which each of us is incorporated. Or then alternately, the other side of the coin is if you start from individuals as already constituted beings, and then you try to build up a group out of them. And so various ways of doing this would be to sort of attribute a certain kind of needs to the individuals that can only be fulfilled through association with other individuals. So an individual has needs for protection from animals or whatever need you want to take, and can only fulfill that need by associating with other individuals. And so that's the origin of the group. So these are sort of two opposite ways of reducing the group to an individuality. Either the group itself is one already constituted individual, or the group is just the product of the needs that are inherent in all the individuals. And so there's either way you look at it, or either side you start from, there's no actual genesis of an individual. And so this notion of a collective genesis is meant to sort of avoid the difficulties of either of those positions, and allow us to observe the genesis of the collective rather than having a presupposition of an individual and having to explain its interaction with the group. And so and there's a question from Angus about this line of form interacting with form, and asking, is this would an example of this idea be the points that I mentioned earlier about the supersaturated solution only being able to give rise to certain forms of crystal? I think that this idea of form interacting with form is at work in that example, in the sense that the crystalline germ that is inserted into the solution has to be of the right form for a crystallization to happen. So there's for a particular substance, it has a certain set of crystalline structures it is capable of taking on, and as long as the crystalline germ has one of those structures, then the solution will crystallize around the germ. But then if you insert a germ with a different crystalline structure, the crystallization process won't work properly. You'll probably, I'm just guessing now, but I would assume what would happen is you would end up with a crystallization in the form, one of the forms that belongs to that substance, but it would crystallize around this germ of a different form, and so there would be like multiple layers of the crystal, and rather than a uniform crystalline structure. So in general, there's always a form. There's never a sort of pure matter in the sense of the hylomorphic schema. So the matter already has a form and is already capable of taking on different forms through given the potentials that are present within it, and it always interacts with other forms in the way that the crystalline germ interacts with the forms of the matter in the crystallization example. One other point that I should probably mention, something that we've seen a couple of times already, but just as a reminder, this notion of symbol. He used the term symbol in the last paragraph that we read, I believe. So whenever Simondon is talking about symbols, he always has in mind this relationship between two complementary realities. So the sort of root meaning of the word symbol is a token that is broken in half. This was an ancient Greek practice of having a token broken in half and using the two halves to recognize each other. And this was used as a way of maintaining a relationship between two families, for example, where you'd pass on the token or the half token and use it to recognize the corresponding half in another family. So whenever Simondon talks about a symbol, that's always the image that he has in mind, is this these two half tokens that are complementary to each other. Right, and so Angus has posted a comment here that the pieces only fit together if we think the milieu and if we think of form and matter as pieces, they don't fit together. Yeah, I think that's right. So the milieu and the individual arise together out of the pre-individual reality. So they're complementary to each other, whereas form and matter are meant to be sort of prior to the individual. They're notions that are meant to be clear in themselves, and it's only it's once they sort of once you try to fit those two notions together, they don't form that symbol in the same way as the individual and its associated milieu do. Okay, so we can go on to the next bit here. Let's see. I can read a page or so. For being to being relation to be possible, there must be an individuation that envelops the beings between which there is relation. This supposes that there is within individuated beings a certain charge of the undetermined, i.e. of pre-individual reality that has passed through the operation of individuation without being effectively individuated. This charge of the undetermined can be called nature. It must not be conceived as pure virtuality, which would be an abstract notion arising to a certain extent from the hylomorphic schema, but as a veritable reality charged with potentials, actually existing as potentials, i.e. as an energy of a metastable system. The notion of virtuality must be replaced with that of a system's metastability. The collective can emerge starting from the charge of pre-individual reality contained within individuated beings, and not based on an encounter of previously existing form and matter. The individuation of the collective is the relation between individuated beings. The relation starting from individuated beings and depending on their very individuality taken as a term is not what founds the relation and constitutes the collective. Without individuation, there can be no being, and without the being, there can be no relation. The bonds that can exist between already individuated beings and that would be established between their individualities, grasped on the basis of an individuation of the collective, would merely be an inter-individual relation, like the interpsychological relation. The collective has its own ontogenesis, its own operation of individuation that utilizes the potentials carried by the pre-individual reality contained in already individuated beings. The collective manifests through the internal resonance within the collective. It is real as a stable relational operation. It exists physikos and not logikos. The birth of an intersubjective relation is conditioned by the existence of this charge of nature within subjects, the persistence of a pre-individuality within individuated beings. Manifestations like emotion in the individual being seem impossible to explain in accordance with only the content and structure of the individuated being. It is certainly possible to invoke a certain phylogenetic conditioning that influences ontogenesis and to reveal in emotion the characteristics of adaptation to critical situations. In fact, these aspects of adaptation raised by Darwin indeed exist, but they do not exhaust the whole reality of emotion. Through emotion, the being disadapts as much as it adapts. If adaptation is reduced to behaviors that guarantee the security of the individual qua individual. If, in fact, emotion poses problems to psychology that are so difficult to resolve, this is because it cannot be explained in accordance with the being considered as totally individuated. Emotion reveals the persistence of the pre-individual within the individuated being. It is this real potential that, within the natural undetermined, evokes within the subject the relation inside the collective that establishes itself. There is the collective to the extent that an emotion structures itself. In the situation of solitude, emotion is like an incomplete being that will only be able to systematize itself according to a collective that will individuate. Emotion is something pre-individual revealed within the subject and can be interpreted as interiority or exteriority. Emotion refers to exteriority and to interiority because emotion is not something individuated. It is the exchange within the subject between the charge of nature and the individuated being's stable structures. Exchange between the pre-individual and the individuated, emotion prefigures the discovery of the collective. Emotion is a calling into question of the being in its individual aspect insofar as its capacity to evoke an individuation of the collective. Insofar as it is the capacity to evoke an individuation of the collective that will overlap and link the individuated being. Right, so we have here this notion of relation, which is one of the key notions of this work. And again, this is pointing back to the introduction, where he sort of brings in the hypothesis or the principle that relation is going to have the status of being. A large part of this book is just working out the consequences of this hypothesis. It's only insofar as you have something like an ontogenesis that you can actually think of relation as having the status of being, as opposed to thinking of relation as something exterior to beings. So that a being would have its inherent properties, it would have certain features that are inherent to it, and then would only subsequently enter into relations as something external to it. So we instead have to think of relations as constituting what a being is, and so it's only through an account of ontogenesis that we can understand relation as having the status of being, as being part of what an individual is or what an entity is. And so this he also brings up this notion of metastability, which we've seen throughout the book. And then, so this notion of metastability is just the idea of a state that is sort of provisionally stable. It's a state that is capable of further transformation. So there's it's not a fully stable state in the sense of a state that would be the lack of potentials for further transformation. So it's only a state that is provisionally stable but has the capacity for undergoing further transformation that is metastable. And so that he contrasts this with the notion of virtuality. And I think we can sort of compare this to Bergson's idea of possibility as a sort of copy of the real, and his criticism of that notion. So when we talk about virtuality for Simondon, it's the idea of a sort of image of the real that would the possible as an image of the real, or the possible as like a sort of copy of the real, as opposed. So it's a purely logical notion of possibility, as opposed to this idea of potentials as a physical something real, a real capacity to bring about a transformation. And so it's this notion of potentials that we should be holding on to, rather than this idea of the virtual as a copy of the real. And then, right, so then he applies this notion of relation to the collective. And so if we want to think of the collective while avoiding those two opposed positions that I mentioned a while ago about either treating the collective as this sort of pre-existing individual in which we're all incorporated, or on the other hand, bringing about the collective through some sort of something inherent within the individuals, some need or some capacity that is inherent in the individuals themselves. If you want to avoid both of those options, then we need to have some notion of the individuation of the collective and the ontogenesis of the collective. And so it's only by thinking relation as this notion of thinking relation as having the status of being is sort of correlated with this notion of the ontogenesis of the collective, because it's only if we have an account of the ontogenesis of the collective that we can think the relation between the individual and the collective, or one individual and another, as something that's constitutive of those individuals rather than some sort of external relation imposed on those individuals. Yeah, and a question from Ione. So giving relation the status of being means a co-creation. How does this relation take shape by way of the collective? Yeah, so that's sort of what I was talking about there. So it's only because we can think of the collective as being a product of a second individuation um, in which the subject undergoes more individuation. So the subject as something that contains both an individuated being and a pre-individual being. So it's only because the subject contains this pre-individual charge or this aspect of nature that they can undergo further individuation and that further individuation in the form of the collective. Yeah, and so the sort of follow-up question here, so how do we differentiate between the characteristics of this beingness as opposed to co-creation of relation as object with form and matter? I think, if I understand correctly, I think the relation between form and matter is a sort of external relation in the sense that we're supposed to understand the notion of form and the notion of matter independently. We're supposed to be able to understand each of those notions on their own, and then we combine them together in some way to bring about an individual, as opposed to when we look at the ontogenetic position, we don't start from sort of pre-existing or terms that are meant to be understood independently as our starting point. We start from the process of individuation itself, and then the sort of analogs of form and matter are the extreme points of that process, as opposed to pre-existing terms.
Well, thanks for that. That definitely is addressing the point. This is a very interesting idea around the kind of fluidity that this conceptual way of thinking about the individuation and the kind of emergence or genesis of a collective takes place. The previous paragraph to the reading that you just did, the very end of it, right underneath the part where he mentions symbol, it sort of is a preamble, like leads into that next paragraph where he starts talking more about relation. But in the very end of that previous reading, he kind of outlines or sketches a little bit the idea that in a collective, and I'm thinking like in a small collective setting, where there's no, he's trying to point out that the what's the word I'm looking for? I was thinking the alchemy, but not really the alchemy, but the exchange and sort of the heterogeneity, the admixture of individuals and individuation. It seems to either renew the pre-individual status of each member of the collective, or it does something to the pre-individual. You guys probably can answer what that is, but it seemed to activate that, forming the idea and the concept that the collective is not hierarchical in the formation of the relations. And this is prior to this new introduction of a higher level concept where we have the relation as a kind of a being that seems to be differentiated from an object which has like signification, where it's like this being requires an ongoing process. So it's definitely interesting to think of it in this type of a frame of, in a small collective, there is no real hierarchy because the second one brings in signification. I think there is the adverse effect on the fragility of the genesis, creating, trying to introduce some sort of hierarchy, forcing what seems to be a very natural process. And so what I'm trying to say is, in that previous paragraph, he talked a little bit about how the collective and each individuation that's involved seems to allow for a kind of genesis. And I'm wondering what the effect on the pre-individual is for that. And then later, this idea of the relation is really interesting, because if the beingness of the relation is expanded beyond the dyad, then that's what made me curious about how we can really differentiate the ontological sense of this beingness of the relation is different than like an object that is being co-created. How we can kind of focus in on the organic nature of this beingness, as opposed to, I don't know, I'm trying to attribute some sort of aliveness to the beingness of the relation, as opposed to like an inorganic kind of idea of a construction, something that might seem more like an object, with
Right.
with various significations.
Right. Yeah. So there's a couple points in there that are worth highlighting, I think. So you mentioned about how this collective individuation has an effect on the individual, and I think that's right. So it's only because the individual is not the complete reality. So the individual, as an individuated being, always has this charge of pre-individual reality that is associated with it, and then there can be this further individuation in the collective that brings about a transformation in the individual. So the individual, and this is connected with what we were talking about earlier, with this ordeal of solitude, as a sort of de-differentiation in the individual. So an individual that is already constituted and in some sense is adapted to its environment, can undergo some sort of crisis or some sort of process of de-individuation, and then re-individuate into a collective. And we'll see more on this as we continue to read about emotions, as this process of de-individuation and re-individuation. And then I think one point where I would want to make a sort of qualification is when you suggest that we think of the individual in terms of organism or something along those lines. I think we have to be careful not to sort of extend concepts from vital individuation to other modes of individuation. So he gives us an account of the individuation of a living being, and this is a specific portion of the whole system, and other forms of individuation. In particular, when we talk about physical individuation, we're talking about something that is not alive and or not organic in that sense. And I think it is worthwhile to sort of keep those different terms separate, precisely because he gives us an account of the genesis of living beings as something distinct from non-living entities of some kind. So we can still think the individual in physical in physical beings and non-living beings. We can think of physical individuation without sort of importing notions from vital individuation.
Okay, but in the construction of the beingness of the relation, right? Are we constructing something that isn't necessarily a vital individuation? The beingness of the relation that's being generated by way of the relation. What's interesting is how can we should we think of it as, in fact, a kind of non-vital or more inorganic being, or is it a more along the lines of something that is vital, since it is in fact vital individuals that are involved in creating the relation, if it is a kind of being?
Right. I think we'll have to sort of leave that question aside for the moment and keep going. We'll see more about the relationship between the individual and the collective, and the type of individuation that is involved in as we continue. So let's go on to the next bit. I think it should take us to the end of the chapter. Angus, if you want to read.
Yeah. Are we at for being to being?
No, we just read that. I think we're at emotion is incomprehensible.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Okay. Emotion is incomprehensible according to the individual because it cannot find its root in the structures or functions of the individual qua individual. Its adaptation to certain acts or to certain behaviors is merely lateral. It seems that emotion creates a disadaptation so as to be able to remedy this disadaptation by way of a certain number of ancillary manifestations. Indeed, the adaptation-disadaptation criterion does not suffice to account for emotions, since it grasps emotion after the fact in its consequences, or marginally in the reactions of the individual's adaptation to emotion. The individual communicates with emotion and adapts relative to it, so as not to struggle against emotion, as is generally said, but in order to exist with emotion. There is a correlation of the individual and the charge of PreIndividual nature in emotion, but we can only grasp behaviors that do not have their own explanation within themselves if we take on a study of emotion that wants to restrict it to the structures of the individuated being. It will therefore have to rely on a complex set of reductive suppositions, like that of bad faith for Sartre, in order to reduce emotion to a phenomenon of the individual. Emotion also cannot be interpreted correctly by attempting to consider it as social, if the social is conceived as substantial and interior to the birth of emotion, and capable of provoking emotion within the individual by way of an invasive action that comes from outside. Emotion is not the action of the social on what is individual. It is also not the momentum of the constituted individual that would constitute the relation starting from a single term. Emotion is the potential that is discovered as signification by structuring itself within the individuation of the collective. It is incomplete and unachieved as long as it is not fulfilled within the individuation of the collective. It does not exist veritably as emotion outside the collective, but is like a conflict between the PreIndividual reality and the individuated reality within the subject, which is the latency of emotion and is sometimes confused with emotion itself. This emotion is not a disorganization of the subject, so to speak, but the initiation of a new structuration that will be able to stabilize only within the discovery of the collective. The essential instant of emotion is the individuation of the collective. After this instant or before this instant, the complete and veritable emotion cannot be discovered. Emotive latency, the inadequacy of the subject to itself, the incompatibility of its charge of nature and its individuated reality indicates to the subject that it is more than the individuated being and that it contains the energy for a further individuation. But this further individuation cannot take place within the being of the subject. It can only take place through this being of the subject and through other beings as the transindividual collective. Emotion is therefore not implicit sociality or disturbed individuality. It is that which within the individuated being contains the possible participation in further individuations that incorporate the pre-individual reality remaining in the subject. It is not surprising that emotion is situated within the dark zone of the psychosomatic relation. It cannot be thought whatsoever via the hylomorphic schema. Arising from the pre-individual, emotion seems to be able to be grasped before individuation as an invasive disturbance in the individual, and after individuation as a functionally defined signification on the level of the collective. But neither that which is purely individual nor that which is purely social can explain emotion, which is the individuation of pre-individual realities on the level of the collective established by this individuation. Emotion cannot be grasped by the extreme terms of the development, which it joins together through its own cohesion, i.e. the purely individual and the purely social, insofar as these terms are the extreme terms of emotive individuation only because emotion localizes them and defines them as the extreme terms of a relational activity that it establishes. The purely social and the purely individual exist with respect to transindividual reality as the extreme terms of the entire scope of the transindividual. The individual and the social do not exist as antithetical terms with respect to one another. The transindividual has only been forgotten in philosophical reflection because it corresponds to the dark zone of the hylomorphic schema. It seems like the general point here is that the dark zone between psychology and sociology is emotion, which is why the previous sort of attempts to explain it have been inadequate, because they think it from either the individual or the purely social perspective.
Yeah, so there's, I think, two different dark zones going on here, and both of which sort of coincide with emotion. So we have the dark zone between the social and the psychological, or between the collective and the individual. And then we also have a dark zone between the mind and body. And so in the second case, in the mind-body case, emotions obviously have some status or some position on the boundary, or overlapping the boundary between mind and body. So obviously there's a sense in which emotions are psychological states, they're states of the mind, but at the same time we feel emotions in a bodily sense, and you can have a state of fear. Your heart will start beating faster, and you have all sorts of physical responses that are part of your emotional reaction to something. And some authors have tried to sort of reduce emotion to just a physical response. And so the physical response would be the real sort of core of emotion, and then the experience of the emotion would be just sort of an epiphenomenon. And then maybe the more traditional approach would be to take the psychological experience of the emotion as fundamental, and then say that there's this sort of bodily accompaniment that is brought about by that psychological experience. But in either case, you're sort of splitting emotion in half, and then trying to give us an account of the relation between these two halves. Like you have a bodily half of emotion and a psychological half of emotion, and then you have to say that one is the cause of the other, or they interact in some way, or something like that. Whereas for Simondon, we have to start from emotion itself as something that has a genesis. We have to look at how the pre-individual reality is undergoes a further individuation in emotion. And at the same time, this allows us to understand the insertion of the individual in the collective. So we're sort of dealing with two obscurities at the same time. So emotion is something that in the individual is a sort of disadaptation. And so again, we have one sort of approach, a sort of Darwinian approach to emotions would be to treat emotions, the physical response of the emotions, the physical aspect of the emotion, as serving essentially for signaling purposes. And so Darwin, if I remember correctly, he talks about how different sort of universal gestures of human beings, like smiling or frowning or whatever other facial expressions and things like that, as signals of a state to others. And so emotions in this picture would be some sort of mechanism for adapting individuals to the collective. But then we also have this other sort of traditional concept of emotions as something that the individual struggles against, and we have this account of some sort of integration into the collective through suppressing certain emotions. So I mean, we can all think of experiences where someone I don't know, did something that to anger you, and you have to sort of suppress your anger to allow you to maintain a social relationship with that person, even if it's a coworker or someone you don't really have a close relationship to. But there's this sort of universal experience or widespread experience of suppressing our emotions for the sake of maintaining a collective. And so there's this sort of opposition between these two different ways of looking at the relationship between the emotion and the collective. So either emotions are essentially mechanisms to insert us into the collective and to signal to other members of the collective, or emotions are something that have to be suppressed in order to maintain a collective. And so this opposition should be taken as a sign that this notion of the emotion is sort of inadequate, and so we have to instead think of emotion as a part of the insertion of the individual in the collective, in the sense that there's this de-adaptation aspect to emotion. So emotions are, like, we talk about being troubled by emotions or overcome by emotions. There's a sense in which the emotion makes us less able to carry out our sort of day-to-day tasks if we're overwhelmed by a certain emotion. But then through that integration into the collective and that new individuation that we can undergo, we emotion serves as the sort of linkage between the individual and the collective through this new individuation. Right, and so Angus has posted a comment here about something I don't think I've come across this, but I've seen sort of similar ideas, but something like an empirical moral philosophy, which would be the idea is that you would develop a moral philosophy based on universal emotional expressions. Um, right. So, yeah, this sort of approach would be one of the approaches that Simondon is trying to avoid or criticizing here, in the sense that it would sort of start from individuals as already constituted beings that have certain responses, like the emotional expressions of these individuals are sort of built in from the beginning, and we have no account of the individuation or the genesis of these individual beings. So um, I think I think I mean we'll see in the conclusion some account or some discussion of ethics or what type of ethics of individuation we can have. But there's a kind of um, there's a kind of ethics, I think, already built into some of the discussion of spirituality that we've talked about, an ethics of the transindividual. So there's an idea of the good life as the life that brings about this objective immortality through the transindividual. And this is completely opposed to an idea of starting from some basic set of universal emotional expressions and then trying to derive a moral philosophy from that. So yeah, I think that's a good sort of counterexample of something we can set in opposition to what Simondon. Yeah, and so we have another comment from Ione, that emotions seem to be predisposed to a soul or a mind in a transcendental state whereby a pre-individuality may be present. So I wouldn't use the term transcendental, but what I would say is that in emotion we have this experience of undergoing a de-differentiation and a re-differentiation, or de-individualization to and a re-individualization. So we sort of lose our capacity to sort of go about our everyday business, and we sort of reincorporate ourselves into the collective through this process of emotion. So emotion is the experience of undergoing that second individuation that brings about the collective. And so insofar as we experience an emotion on our own and not as part of a collective, that emotion is always incomplete in some sense. It's only in the collective that we have something like a resolution of emotion or a completion. We're a little bit early, but I think this is a good stopping point for today. And we can pick up from the conclusion next time, if that's all right with everyone. Right. So yeah, the conclusion is fairly long. It's I think about 25 to 30 pages. So it'll take us a couple weeks to get through it, but we're getting close to the end of the first volume, which is the book itself. And as I mentioned last time, we'll take a look at another text after we finish that, before we decide whether to go on to read the second volume.
I started reading the conclusion, and in that first couple of sentences, he says that there's a kind of normativity, I guess, that we can establish on the, thinking the collective through the transindividual. I'm interested to see if it has to do with the distinction between the two senses of transindividual that we've discussed a few times.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't have an answer, but we'll have to keep that in mind as we read the. Okay, so thanks everyone. Hope you have a good holiday for those who are celebrating, and I'll see you all next week.